interesting to me because this is never, this is something that's never been discussed before, and I am on something that I don't know how to do. It's not. Sorry, technical thing. Hmm? I know. That's okay. That's perfectly all right. These things happen. Oh, hey, how are you? It has nothing to do with me, my presentation.
Sorry, folks. Why is he in it?
All right, I'll just get started by discussing how I got started with my project. Several years ago, I was privileged enough to take a class with the late great Dr. Clement Price at Rutgers University, Newark. It was one of the last classes he taught before he passed away. Unfortunately, tragically, we lost a great mind. There were many times when I was doing my research where I could just wish I could have emailed him or called him, and it hurts me that I wasn't able to do that. But I miss him. I think anybody who knew him misses him. But I took a class with him called Slavery and Emancipation in American History, and he got me into thinking a lot about just the general subject of slavery and the laws of emancipation, and we read a lot of really great texts that year. And then a couple semesters later, I took a class called Public History of Slavery in America with a visionary public historian, Lyra Montero, who is she's an activist. She is very in tune with like pointing things out. She took blinders off when you attended this class, because what she did is she made you look at different things in a different way. She would say, let's dig a little deeper and see what happens. She also did some public history works for her graduate studies. She did something called 1,000 Ships, which is performed at Waterfire in Providence, Rhode Island, which is what they did is they went out and they were talking to people and teaching them about the history of the slave trade in Providence that not many people knew about. So she was kind of like, and she was very involved in that. She's also kind of, the late Clem Price. This is what I was talking about, 1,000 Ships. If you look up anything that I've done, you can look up, you can see it. There's a thing called Waterfire in Providence. And they just went out and they started talking to people. And it was just this amazing, amazing thing she shared with us in class. And that's the kind of thing that I kind of want to do, get involved. She's also kind of gained notoriety in some circles for this article she wrote about the musical Hamilton, because she looked at it as a work of public history. And she pointed out some things that she found difficult with the musical, as far as what did she say about she asked questions and about certain decisions within the musical, including relegating slavery to the background or ignoring it entirely. Most recently, she wrote an article about how we as historians, can enjoy works of art that we find problematic things like Hamilton, because she'll tell you she loved it, but she just found things wrong with it, like certain things, you know. But that's what she did. She liked to poke holes in things. She liked to look at narratives and say, what aren't they saying? This is a book that inspired me greatly, Ebony and Ivy by Craig Stephen Wilder. There wasn't a lot, there was nothing written about this aspect of history, slavery and the how universities were founded by slave owners and funded by the slave trade. And his work is really the foundation for what a lot of other universities are doing right now. Rutgers, Georgetown, Columbia, just to name a few. And a lot of what he did intersected with what I did. I attended a presentation he did at Rutgers Newark. A lot of the names that he was mentioning were ones that I knew about. Some people in the Presbyterian Church may recognize the name John Witherspoon, Ashbel Greene, men who were slave owners and founded these or taught at these universities. So then my next step was I started looking at more local sources. And I came upon this, which is instrumental. I carry it around with me in my backpack because I just like to, I'll flip through it and I'll just look, because it's like, you know, you refresh your memory when you're looking at things again and again and again. So David Muchos, he unfortunately passed away this past year. He was very generous when I emailed him, and he kind of guided me along the way. I was able to look at his records, the things that he kept at the Morris County Heritage Commission over at the county library, and I was able to get the idea that I was on the right track because I was trying to find things out. Then I looked up just general search because I was able to take people's names, and that brought me to places. And one of the places it brought me to was the Presbyterian Church. Again, probably familiar with this. It's available online. You can get it. You can look at it here at the library. But it's a great source. Within the history, you have these two things. You have the combined records and what's called the Bill of Mortality. What that is that they kept records of who died, when they died, and sometimes what they died from. But I found evidence within the history of the Presbyterian Church where, you know, because it's available online on archives.org, you can do like a quick search, and I came and just search slaves. And I found reference to seating for slaves of consequential families. Consequential families. Who are these consequential families? And I also came up with the understanding that servants, or quote, meant slaves. Generally accepted that these people weren't paid. They were definitely enslaved of African descent. African Americans, let's say. So then I looked at other church records, and remember how we said seating for slaves of consequential families. I dug a little bit deeper in the surrounding areas, and I found this great document, great picture diagram in Tuttle's. It's got the Tuttle family was very prominent. They were all like priests and lawyers and whatever. But this was in the diagram of the Madison Presbyterian Church, and is very similar to references that I found in Mendon Presbyterian of seating under the stairs was provided for the enslaved. So if you look closely, here and here, it says blacks. Here's the pulpit. Here's the stairs. Here are the slaves. So, and if you're familiar with how things were run at Presbyterian churches, they paid for the church with pew rentals. And if you didn't pay your rent, that became a problem. So it's like, these are the prominent families, and you had the gallery. If you go to a place like New Providence Presbyterian Church, it's that old style where there's a seating down and there's a seating up. Same thing over at First Hanover. Same sort of deal. Seating down, seating up, that sort of thing. So what I did was here's some more stuff from the combined records, which is you have references to the baptisms of enslaved children, marriages, which is uncommon, and they also kept records of, again, this is the Bill of Mortality right here. So you're able to get a glimpse of how life was for them back then, because then you're able to take these people in there, you get names, and that's something they didn't have before. So we're able to know who they were, and you see names, common names back then, like Phoebe, Tom, John, things like that. I can take questions. Okay, yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, this is. Thank you. I'm talking about a broad period of time. I started with just before the Revolution, and my final paper was written focusing on the time around the Civil War. But these references are, this is 1770, let me get a closer look on my screen here. You got 1776, some of these deaths, 1777, 1804, it goes on. You get to see, especially interesting to me, and it's common knowledge, 1777, there was a smallpox outbreak, and you see a lot of deaths in that year. But they recorded them, which was uncommon. You don't see a Bill of Mortality, and you certainly don't see a Bill of Mortality for enslaved people. Not here. This is the only one we got. Luckily, it's been preserved. I mean, Presbyterian churches were very good at keeping records. They some were better than others. Morristown was the best. The one from Booton, not that great. Is scribbles, unorganized. But then again, they had their own problems, and eventually I'll get to Booton and talk to them about that. Coming soon. So what I did, this is an Excel file I created. It's not a very good slide. But what I did was I took what Muchos had, and I combined it with what were the combined records, Bill of Mortality, and I created my own slave records. And within these slave records, you see names of not only, like you see the names of the enslaved, like I mentioned, you see names like Phoebe, Tom, John, but you also see names like Cato, and Brister, and Cuff, and things like that. So to put it bluntly, no white person named their kid Cato. So we know these people were enslaved. We know they're African Americans who were enslaved in Morris County by consequential families. And who were these consequential families? Well, you see the name Timothy Johns in there. You see Silas Condict. You see the Pruden family, Daniel Phoenix, John Dowdy. And the other part of my research, sorry it took so long to get to this point, was part of being a public historian is you go to places and you investigate. Either you can just sit there and watch people interacting with historical objects. Or you just go there yourself and see how it interacts with its surroundings. This is a Century 21 building. We're familiar with this on the corner over here by the Greene. There are plaques. If you haven't noticed, look up. There's plaques on there. Timothy Johns is up there. I'm going to come up to it in a second, but John Dowdy's up there. Betsy Schuyler's up there. So let's just talk about her for a second. So this is Phillip Skylar. This is Betsy Schuyler's father. In Craig's book, in the Ebony and Ivy book, he goes into some detail about these consequential families who gained part of their fortunes through the slave trade. The Schuyler family was one of them. There's a lot of these rich, influential families back then. Like I said, the Schuylers, Betsy's mother, the Ben, I don't know if I pronounced this correctly, Ben Resliers. Let's try that one. Reslier. Thank you. The Bottineau family, the Van Cortlands, they're all basically, they're from New York. But Craig tells a story in his book about how the Schuylers were involved in the slave trade. And we all know who Betsy Schuyler met in Morristown, right? Right. We're familiar with this? Okay. Alexander Hamilton. All right, so Craig also brings it up in Ebony and Ivy, how this is a great sequence of quotes from Craig from that book, referring to Hamilton. He says, "A job with a slave trader had rescued him from poverty. Donations from slave traders saved him from despair. His new life began with his arrival on a slave trader's ship." So that brings us to, sorry, real quick, skipping. Betsy Schuyler also stayed, while she was here, she stayed at the home of Jabez Campfield, Dr. Jabez Campfield. He was also a slave owner. He owned a number of slaves. He had a slave named Hannah, who married a man named William, a quote-unquote black man, servant of Joseph Pruden. She gave birth to children named John in 1807, Belinda Sappho in 1808, Colin in 1810, Anthony in 1813, and Tavy in 1818. The National Park Service performed a survey at the house in 2008, where it concluded that Campfield built an addition or extended kitchen with a room above it as a way of housing the enslaved on his property. So when I go to the Hamilton house, the Schuyler Hamilton house, Campfield house, and I ask questions about the slaves who lived there, I'm not trying to catch people off guard. I'm curious as to what happened to them and what happened to their story. So we're kind of situated a lot of times when we talk about history about big people, big men like Alexander Hamilton, and Betsy Schuyler. They fall in love. It's a romantic story. But when you dig a little deeper, like Lyra taught me, you take the blinders off a little bit. I mean, what else? What other stories need to be told? So, as I moved on with my research, I found out that Jude Pfister from the National Park Service wrote a book about the Ford Mansion, and in that book he was talking about how when we talk about certain aspects of history, we talk about Washington slept here, that sort of thing. So I said, so did the slaves, so did the enslaved people. And that's why I named my master's essay, The Enslaved Slept Here Too. Because these people, they lived, they breathed, they got married, they passed away, they're buried. So, I mean, that's the sort of story I was trying to tell. So, that is not to say that everybody was a slave owner. We're not talking about, you know, like massive slave trade with pens and auctions and things like that. There were some people who were against slavery. One person that I found was really interesting was this gentleman who became sort of a personal hero of mine. There's no good pictures of him, unfortunately. His name was Jacob Greene. He was the pastor at the First Hanover Church in Hanover, New Jersey. Scott Rohrer wrote this great book. He goes into the various aspects of Greene's life. I wish I could talk more about Jacob. He's awesome. But he was this lone voice, kind of like screaming out in the darkness against slavery in Morris County at the time of the Revolution, because he did he preached what became known as the Fast Day Sermon at the First Church of Hanover. What it was he was saying that kind of a revolutionary thought was slavery was a sin, and the revolution was failing because of sin, and the revolution was failing because of sin and slavery. He was extending this idea. People didn't like that idea. His Fast Day Sermon was published in the New Jersey Journal. It was published in Chatham. This is another great book by David. This is also available. It includes the Fast Day Sermon and the pseudonymous, did I get that right? Debate that took place in the New Jersey Journal between Jacob, who was writing under a pseudonym Eumenes, with someone calling himself Elobo. And Elobo had some very interesting ideas about slavery, including why African Americans should remain slaves. Again, something I wish I could go more in depth into, but just kind of got to move along. The big debate that was going on, like I mentioned, in the Presbyterian Church at the time, was that some people were saying slavery was evil, while other people were saying slavery was a sin. As you can see, they kind of broke it down as to what this meant to the community, to the individual. If it was an evil, and most people thought it was an evil, it was a social evil. But that was between the slaveholder and God. If you were a neighbor of a slave owner, you could sit next to him at church. There was no condemnations. But because the Bible had stuff about slavery in it, verses about slavery in it, as long as you followed those rules, you were okay. And then, on the other side, slavery was a sin. You couldn't go and sit in the congregation. You couldn't receive communion, and you were condemned to hell. So, I mean, these are big things, and the last thing any slave owner wanted to do was be called a sinner. So there's a big push, both sides, and then in 1789, this was the official decision by the Presbyterian Church. Yes.
What do you mean by the Presbyterian?
Oh, I'm sorry. The General Assembly. This is the national decision. Presbyterian churches have sort of like a constitutional way of running things. They have representatives that are elected, and that they have meetings. The General Assembly met once a year, which led to other problems, but we'll get into that in a little bit. So the General Assembly, I'm sorry, I just going to say, could we save some questions to the end? I don't want to keep stopping and starting and lose my track. Sorry. So we're saying, okay, they say slavery was an evil. it meant there was no condemnation of slavery or the slave owner. And as long as there was, abided by the rules dictated in the Bible, you were okay. But you had to prepare slaves for freedom through Christianization and education. So we see some evidence of this through the baptisms and marriages and things like that we spoke of before. If you're baptizing them, you're Christianizing them. Education came later. They had special schools. They called African schools. There was one in Parsippany. There's not much written about that, unfortunately. It came and went. So then we have another big event in 1804. Again, there's a push within the state to for abolition, emancipation, but again, there was a compromise. This is what they came up with, and there are other laws that were passed about slavery in New Jersey, but this is the one that my sources point to the most as the big influencer. So New Jersey was the last northern state to pass one of these. Other, like New York, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and those states had these already. But it was gradual. It wasn't immediate because there was always this fear that if you free all the slaves, what happens to the economy? What happens to this? What happens to that? They're really worried about the white man's world, not really worried about them. So these are the basics of it. After July 4th, 1804, any child who was born was free, which is why Abolition Day was celebrated on July 5th. And then this is one of the things that was prevalent in the slave records of Morris County, which is the births were registered with the county, and children being wards of the state, but they could be indentured later on. But here's one of the caveats: the parents were still slaves. So here are some of the consequences that I found. So this is a big one. There was some evidence that I found of abandonment because they didn't want to fund or help the newly freed people. They would abandon them. And I found evidence of this in Aquanic, Pompton Lakes. The other thing is that there was this idea that there was a threat posed by freed people to the white way of life. So Presbyterian minister Robert Finley, who was in Basking Ridge, came up with the idea of colonization, sending freed people to Africa. This gained this was very popular, and it gained some financial backing from people in Morris County. It was one of those things where, I mean, who's going to volunteer to go to Africa? I mean, come on. You had to volunteer to go. It was nobody was unsuccessful financially, but they kept bringing this idea up throughout the 19th century as a way to deal with freed people, which is terrible. So then, I came to a juncture where there's that Gradual Emancipation Act. I saw the names of these consequential families again. They appeared in the slave records of Morris County as registering births and things like that. So here are just some of the names that appeared, and we'll talk about them in a second. Here's Silas. Here's John Dowdy. They got their own plaques on the side of the Century 21 building. One of the slave-owning families was Peter the Campbell family. Anybody ever driven down that Campbell Avenue? Okay, that was named after his plantation. When Peter died, this is his transcription of his will. You see right here, 12 neighborhood persons, their property that he willed to his children. But his children would free the slaves, emancipate the slaves, and grant them lands where they became farmers and things like that out in New Vernon, Harding area. But we also have this interesting, what I found to be remarkable. Here, this is 1804, 1805, 1806, 1804 is up here. You have what became known as the triple wedding, where three enslaved couples got married. Some of them were actually Paris, servant of Richard Campbell. You have York. You have Cato, another Cato. And then down here you have Brister, servantman of Abigail Condict. Abigail Condict was Silas's widow. So this is all in the combined records. So you just see this mass, like it's within these few years here, you see people getting married, and like you didn't see that before. So I just, I think it has a lot to do with the gradual emancipation. You get to see a little bit more of a liberalized ideas. You see more baptisms, you see more marriages, that sort of thing. But again, you see their names, and they didn't have names before, and this is just like a fascinating document to me. Then again, here's Silas. Here's Silas again. He's buried in the Presbyterian churchyard. He was a lawyer and a statesman. The combined records show that he had a number of the slave children baptized. After his death, his wife Abigail freed a number of the enslaved, and there's a county park named after him in Kinnelon. So Silas Condict Park, Kinnelon. You can go for a walk. So then there's another remarkable case in the churchyard. This is Cato's grave. If you go there, you go in the walk down the center, you come across this fence. Just outside the fence, you have Cato. They repaired the tombstone. He is a quote-unquote loyal servant to Daniel Phoenix and the Phoenix family. This is the only documented slave burial I could find. Some freed people, we'll come to them in a second. There's one other gentleman, Zenas Campbell, who's buried in Basking Ridge. He served in the Civil War. I wrote the government about giving him a tombstone because he doesn't have a tombstone. All he has is a little dial, one of those little things, the Grand Army of the Republic shield outside of where he's buried. He doesn't even have a tombstone. And when I wrote to the Veterans Administration, I was told I needed more documentation. So, still working on that. Okay, here's another gentleman, another interesting case. His name is John Dowdy. Oh, by the way, Phoenix and Dowdy were both served in the Revolution. Dowdy was a artillery general, I believe. They both came back to Morristown. They both made a lot of money, real estate, that sort of thing. John, this is a transcription of his will from the slave records, the Muchos book, where he frees the enslaved people. Brister, Jacob and his heirs, and I devise to my slave Peter and to his heirs and assign forever all these 2 lots, and he assigned gave a stipend, an allowance to an elderly enslaved person that he freed when he died. But From that, we can look up Jacob Sylvester. Jacob Sylvester was John's slave. He lived in Morristown. He had land, and when Jacob died, the probate courts divided up his land into 10 lots, and because all of his children, except for all his children, had moved away, and they is Jane and Jacob Sylvester are buried in the churchyard, but they're buried. If you go into the churchyard, go to the back right corner towards the fence, you find these 8 headstones. This is Jacob. That's Jane. Move over. It's one of their sons, James, I believe. Also here, if I'm getting my alignment correctly, Hannah Hopper and Phoebe, who was the servant of the Sayre family, who was murdered by Antoine LeBlanc. But these two, this kind of group here was moved from another spot at one point when they were building the office building over here on the corner, the 1776 building, I think it's called. They had to move some of the graves, and they ended up back here. So I mentioned Hannah Hopper. Hannah Hopper was owned by Stephen Vale and worked for Stephen's son-in-law, Isaac Dayton. Here they are. This is Stephen. This is his daughter. This is his son-in-law. Stephen, anybody familiar with at the Speedwell, historic Speedwell? This is a book. This is a good book if you ever want to flip through it. It's really, really good about Speedwell. But this is kind of one of those things where it's like, hey, look, there's something in here we might be able to find. And there's a new, I don't know if there's a, is it in here? Oh yeah, in here. There's a section on slaves and freedom at Speedwell. And from this, I was able to find Stephen's really poor grammar, terrible grammar journal where he talks about his interactions with the enslaved people on his property. This is one of the excerpts from it, and he tells a story about how 3 black persons took 3 of his horses, went into a paper mill pond, and 2 of them came up. One of the slaves died from a kick to the head, according to this, and they buried him in the Methodist burying ground. I don't know where that is. I haven't come across that yet. But the journal is really interesting because it gives us information. We can piece things together, and we get this idea that Stephen was very paternalistic towards the enslaved people. He treated them like children who needed to be disciplined if they misbehaved. He talks about beating them, crushing their hands, things of that nature. If they talk back, if they talk smart to him, stuff like that. He also writes about them trying to escape. That's something we see a lot in the newspapers, which I'll talk about in a couple minutes. Advertisements for escaped slaves. You know, one thing I get when people talk to me about northern slavery, it's like, oh, it wasn't that bad. Well, why were people trying to run away? You know, I mean, think about that for a second. You know, slavery is slavery. Let's not mince this. So the next gentleman I came across is you might be familiar with as well. Called George P. McCulloch Street, named after him. They actually changed the name of the street to name it after him. McCulloch Hall, right around the corner, nice building. So he moves to Morristown. He's already a successful Scottish businessman who had dealings with the French government. So through his connections with the French, he was introduced to Morristown society through the French who were already here. And this gentleman, Vincent Boisabon lived on Treadwell Avenue down here, down the street. It was rumored to be a stop on the Underground Railroad. That's still up in the air. Everybody who thinks with the false basement or a hidden compartment in their house is it's an Underground Railroad. It's not always the case. But interestingly enough, about Vincent Boisabon is he was also a slave owner. He reportedly, according to one local history, owned 1,200 slaves at a plantation when he escaped. He was a wealthy French statesman, and at the time of the French Revolution, he left the plantation and 1,200 slaves. There's also a quaint little story in this local history about how one of these slaves tried to get on the boat that Vincent was on as he was trying to leave. And Vincent, through the kindness of his heart, stopped the boat to pick up his slave and bring him to America. Good old Vincent, nice guy. But so McCulloch gets involved in Morristown society. People go there, they party there, they hang out, they talk about things there. Well, that's an important thing to think about in a couple minutes. But McCulloch Hall is the only place in Morristown, even I dare say Morris County, where I find public acknowledgement of slavery. You go into the basement kitchen, on the wall, there is right here, this sign and a couple others next to each other, documented. And I was there, I visited, I talked to them about it. They seemed to mention that they wanted to do something more with it. Please. But they have mentions in here of what was already written, we find in the slave records of Morris County. But there's also a couple entries that aren't in the slave records. You see Henry and Helen that were born. We don't have any names of the parents. So, also interestingly, this book right here, which is another good book, was John Brett Langstaff wrote this. It's called New Jersey Generations, McCulloch Hall, Morristown. In this book, he mentions very briefly in a couple sentences the slaves there. According to Langstaff, it was rumored that the slaves lived in huts similar to the ones in the Caribbean, up on stilts. Picture that on McCulloch Avenue as you're driving up and down. Think about that for a second. Huts on stilts for enslaved people in Morristown. So you get this idea from these records that this society was building up. And they talked about things, they hung out, they partied, like you mentioned. They most certainly talked about politics. And one of the biggest things that they talked about was most likely slavery. And this is something that kind of pops up when I talk about the Presbyterian Church. Going back to that, is that these rumblings in the local level would go up to the top and then kind of filter back down. Like the discussions that we're having at the local level would kind of conveyor belt themselves the way up to the General Assembly and the higher levels. And then these higher levels would make decisions that would trickle down to the lower levels. That's how it worked. It kind of acted like this as a conveyor belt, as I described it. So the slavery debate was going on at this time within that body, within the Presbyterian Church. So you have this. This is like, I was going to try, I mean, this is one of those things I could spend, if I was teaching a class on this, we would go over this in detail, but we just don't have the time. This is the time period I'm looking at right here. The schism, 1837, 1838. This is available on Wikipedia, which is awesome. This little block of time right here, because this is when we're talking about things shifting in this area. The stuff that kind of coincided, it zigzagged within within the national level of the Presbyterian Church, filtered back down into Morris County. One of the people who was involved in that was this gentleman right here. This is Albert Barnes. He was the influential pastor at Morristown Presbyterian, dapper-looking fella. He, in 1829, he preached down here this sermon called The Way of Salvation, got attention for it, was called to Philadelphia, and then subsequently put on trial for heresy for this and his other writings. He just wouldn't shut up, which was great because he was, he was like this guy who just like had a lot to say. And the thing is about like stuff that's written during this time period. Has anyone tried to read any of this stuff? Yeah, Colleen, my brother-in-law, my sister. Theological stuff. It's like long-winded, like paragraphs or sentences or a paragraph long, colons, semicolons. Anyway, so that's what he did. But after the schism, he became a leader of New School Presbyterianism, and he wrote a lot. And some of the things he wrote about was anti-slavery theses. One was called the Church and Slavery. Good stuff. And he, I think he should be talked about more. I just one of these people. I just wish I had more time for. So, like I said, what this schism means to Morris County is this: you had churches like Morristown that remained old school, but felt the influence of the new school. Barnes was like, people were naming their children after this guy. And they missed him. They wrote letters of support for him, that sort of thing. So what happened is that once they split, you started to have this influx of new school preachers, and a lot of these new school preachers were either anti-slavery or abolitionists. So that sort of thing starts getting welled up within people. And new school ideas were adopted in some areas. Mendham was a place, and they split, their churches split. Booton was a place, but they're kind of a little bit different because of the guy I'm talking about in a couple of minutes. Then you got this idea that, through the readings, it's like, slavery was an issue. Like, there's a debate whether it was the issue, but it was definitely something that it was theological, it was moral, it was civil, and these things were all splitting these churches. One of them was Morristown. For a time, there was two Presbyterian churches. One next door to South Street was now South Street, which is their parish house. Thank you very much. The other one is, of course, the Presbyterian Church that we all know and love. And then there's the idea of, to me anyway, that, if it was just one church doing this, that's one thing. But we're talking about a number of churches, and we're talking about Morris County. So, we're talking about a select area where these churches are splitting up. But talking about it, like, they didn't talk about the split. In the church records, there was a pastor at the time. There were issues with him. People went their separate ways, but they didn't say what the exact reason was. It's one of those things where you go, God, could you just give it to me? Tell me why. But the one place there is acknowledgement of it is at the church right outside the parish house. The sign outside the parish house. And on the sign it says, Morristown was flourishing in the second quarter of the 19th century, and its population supported several religious denominations. However, social unrest in that period was clearly evident, issues pertaining to theology, abolition, and temperance led to strife in many religious communities. So there is some acknowledgement that, abolition was one of the reasons. The same thing happened next door at St. Peter's. Same theme. You've got this idea that there's theological problems theological issues and separations going on at the time. St. Peter's chose to follow high church traditions. There was high church, low church, the old school, new school, kind of along the same lines. And then at, the group left the church during a Sunday service, led by this gentleman by the name of William, excuse me, I'm going to get to him first in a second. William Dewar, who was a former president of Columbia University, and he had problems with some of the people there who were high church. He was used to low church, and they split. Now, the Church of the Redeemer, if anybody's ever been there, they do things differently. They have a very inclusive service. They're non-traditional, and they're like I say here, their website claims that the division was over the high church's pro-slavery beliefs. But again, the sermons and the histories don't say what it was. We're left to our imaginations. And I was left with kind of like this idea of if the slavery debate was not discussed in church records, where can we find evidence of this debate? So I turned to my original idea that you go and look at the press of the time, because people were talking about it, and even if the church records don't mention it, it was the topic of the time. I mean, even around here, you're talking about slavery and secession and that sort of thing in Morris County. And we're talking about it like 20 years before the Civil War. So in Morris County, we had one abolitionist paper printed in, published in Boonton by Dr. John Grimes. He and a small group of abolitionists were involved in the Underground Railroad. This guy is a character. Again, someone I'd love to talk more about. He was a vegetarian before there was vegetarianism. He was into temperance. He was an early stage socialist. You see this paper go from being like all about abolition to talking about what kinds of fruits and vegetables you should grow, and how to stick it to the man and things like that. But he was definitely involved in the Underground Railroad. We know this. There's documented proof of it, and again, a guy who became sort of a personal hero of mine just because he was doing these things that no one else was doing.
What year is it?
This is 1840. This is 1841, 40 something. It was 40. No, excuse me, 47, 48. I'm trying to remember, because 1850 he stopped publishing the Freeman because of the Fugitive Slave Act. Because this sort of stuff would get you would you end up in jail. Being involved in the Underground Railroad, getting caught with escaped slaves, you're going to jail. The Fugitive Slave Act was something that the newspapers supported because there's a law of the land, and if you were a fugitive, if you were doing things illegal, you deserved what happened to you. And John Grimes was one of those people doing illegal things. So again, he's someone. I wish I had more time to talk about him. But in Morristown, you had two newspapers. You had the Jersey Man and the True Democratic Man. Jerseyman was the Whig / Republican paper of the time, and as this denotes, True Democratic Banner, they were the Democrats' voice in town at the time. Jerseymen, they were definitely not abolitionists. They were anti-expansionists. They didn't want slavery to expand into the territories beyond the set demarcations that were set by federal law. But because of that, they called the Fugitive Slave Act the law of the land that must be obeyed. And they kind of tried to toe this middle line between what they believed were radical ideas between the abolitionists and the quote-unquote ultra slaveholders in the South. But what they kind of, it's like confusing with them, because it's like there are times when you're like, oh, they get it, and there are times like they don't, where it's like they condemned the Dred Scott case because they wrote about how the Supreme Court justices were slave owners. And it's like, yeah, of course they're going to side, on the side of the slave owners. They're all slave owners. It makes sense. But, that doesn't make it right. And then the important elections of 1860 and 1864, they backed Abraham Lincoln. On the other side of the coin, you have the True Democratic Banner. If anything, to remember about the True Democratic Banner is that they were anti-abolitionist. They blamed everything on abolitionism. They ran articles about the problems with abolition, what abolitionism has done to the country. It has shed blood. It has torn apart churches and communities. Not the slave owners, the abolitionists. So they, before, during, and after the Civil War, they talked about it was abolitionists' fault. They said that the North was fighting for the wrong reasons. New Jersey's boys were dying, were shedding their blood for abolitionists, and this is wrong. You see, they backed Douglas in 1860, and then they backed McClellan in 1864. But so did New Jersey, and so did Morris County. So there you go. I don't know if I would want George McClellan as my president. He was a bit of a military doof. But that being said, that's my personal opinion. My father could probably talk to you more about that later. So these are just some, to just get an idea of what's going on in the publisher's minds at this time. This is, these are just some of the quotes. This is what I was talking about before, the Dred Scott case. The majority of the U.S. Supreme Court are slaveholders. This fact may account for their discernible, it's very blotchy, the paper, and whatever opinion that if recognized as valid and binding. So you get, this is how they wrote. It's like so trying to find evidence amongst this stuff, because it's like that big. No, not a very good PDF. Then this is from the True Democratic Banner from the election of 1864. They said that the president's guards of abolitionists were trying to turn the election. They said that Lincoln let the troops go on furlough so they could vote for Lincoln. But they said the true democratic principles of the people of Morris may well be considered immovable and enduring after the vain but desperate effort just made by abolition republicanism to overwhelm them. Morris voted for McClellan, and so did the state. And there they celebrate. Again, her gallant democracy are deserving of all praise for preventing the state from being swept away like driftwood by the dark flood of abolitionism. True Democratic Banner, 1864, published in Morris County, in Morristown. Then you have a reaction. This is long, but you talk about, it is true, this is from the Jerseyman. Remember, this is the Republican paper, printed in 1865. They're talking about the Emancipation Proclamation, and it's talking about, or 13th Amendment, kind of combination between the 13th Amendment, and just like this overall idea of what should happen now. And it's talking about how the Republican Party was to stop the expansion of slavery, but nothing to do with equal rights for African Americans once they were free. Again, Morristown, 1865. I will have, I can send all this stuff if you can't finish reading. And then this is another thing from the True Democratic Banner after the 13th Amendment. This is something that I found interesting. The inferior tribe of mankind shall become extinct. The Negro will disappear by the manifest decree of God and not by the injustice of man. They're bringing up this idea that what they felt were weaker races would disappear from the earth like the Indian. Kind of, All right, so, this is the last slide. So, this is, constantly ask from the perspective of a public historian, what stories do we want to tell? What are we going to tell? I mean, we talk about the great people doing great things, the big people doing big things. We talk about Alexander Hamilton. We talk about Betsy Schuyler. We talk about George Washington. We talk about these people. What about the enslaved? What about the enslaved who slept here too? So I think I'm sure this question might be asked. I think there should be some form of public recognition about enslaved people in Morris County, particularly in Morristown, somewhere. Because they slept here too. And if my research is any indication of the way they lived, the way they died, the way they got married and had children. I mean, they slept here too. That's that. Thank you. Okay. Whew. Sorry. Wow.